In 2014, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Hudson, Florida, something unspeakable was about to unfold. A family's life was shattered. Their deaths would leave the community in horror, their names etched in infamy. This is the chilling tale of Megan Brown, her parents Margaret and Greg Brown, and her new boyfriend, Nicholas Leonard. And, at the heart of it all, the man responsible for the horrific murders, Adam Matos. The town of Hudson, nestled just an hour north of Tampa, was a place where families lived in peace, where neighbors greeted each other with smiles and waves. The Browns were a part of that peace. They were an ordinary family, ordinary in every way except for one tragic truth, the darkness that was lurking, hiding just out of sight. It was a darkness that would eventually descend upon them with devastating force. And that darkness was Adam Matos. Megan Brown was 27 years old, bright and full of life. She had a smile that could light up a room and a heart full of hope. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone whose future seemed full of possibility. Megan had recently found new love with Nicholas Leonard, a man she truly cared for. Nicholas was everything Adam Matos could never be: gentle, kind, and caring. Megan and Nicholas's relationship seemed perfect, filled with promise for the future. But the past was never truly gone. Adam Matos, Megan's ex-boyfriend, would never let go of her. His obsession with her and his refusal to accept their breakup would drive him to commit unspeakable acts. Adam Matos was a man who couldn't handle rejection. His relationship with Megan had been violent, manipulative, and filled with turmoil. From the outside, he seemed like just another man in the neighborhood, but there was a darkness inside him that would eventually emerge with horrific consequences. Their breakup had been messy, but Megan had moved on. She was ready to start fresh, to build a life with Nicholas Leonard, but Adam wasn't ready to let her go. Their relationship was a roller coaster, full of emotional highs and terrifying lows. Adam's possessiveness and jealousy had taken hold. He couldn't understand why Megan would choose someone else over him. His mind began to twist, his sense of reality warping with each passing day. Megan had tried to escape him, but Adam was relentless. He stalked her, he harassed her. And even though she had moved on, Adam couldn't. In the days before the murders, Adam's presence in the Brown family's life was becoming more noticeable. Neighbors had begun to report seeing him around their home, lurking near the front yard, hanging around in the shadows. The Browns had already been wary of him. Margaret and Greg Brown had seen firsthand how toxic Adam's influence had been on their daughter. They had hoped that by keeping a distance from him, they could shield their daughter from his control. But Adam wasn't so easily dismissed. He would come and go, showing up unannounced, and each time he did, the tension in the air would rise. Something about his presence felt wrong, almost predatory. But nobody truly understood the danger he posed. At least, not yet. Megan's parents had every reason to be concerned, but Adam's visits were often brief, fleeting moments that seemed harmless on the surface. To the outside world, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. But those closest to the family could feel it, the growing sense that something was off. As the days passed, there was an unsettling quiet in the house. No one had any idea that the storm was brewing just on the horizon. Megan's life was slowly being pulled apart by someone who would not let go. Adam wasn't just her ex. He had become a looming figure in their lives, a constant reminder that their peace was an illusion. Megan tried to break free. She tried to keep moving forward with Nicholas, who had become her anchor, her safe haven. But Adam was never too far behind. The stage was set for an eruption, an explosion of violence that no one could have anticipated. What happened next would shake the small town of Hudson to its core. The Browns would never be the same. and the name Adam Matos would forever be associated with terror. Adam had made his decision. He wasn't going to let go, and the time to act had come. But what he didn't know was that the very thing he thought he was fighting for, Megan, was slipping further from his grasp with every passing moment. He didn't understand that no matter how hard he tried to keep her, she had already chosen her future. And that future was one that didn't include him. As Adam's obsession festered, so did his rage. The quiet, seemingly unremarkable days before the murders were filled with a sense of dread, a subtle undercurrent of fear that no one could name. The chilling truth was that no one really knew how close the danger was. The Brown family had no idea that the nightmare would soon come crashing through their door. Adam Matos wasn't just an ex-boyfriend who couldn't handle rejection. He had transformed into something far darker. The line between love and hate had blurred, and now the bloodshed was inevitable. That morning in August, the town of Hudson would wake up to a nightmare. The Brown family would never be the same, and neither would the world that had once felt so safe. It was the start of something no one could stop. The terror began in the shadows. It ended in a bloodbath. And it left behind a trail of devastation that would haunt Hudson forever. In the days leading up to the unimaginable slaughter, the tension in the Brown household was palpable. No one could have predicted what was coming, but there were signs, subtle, eerie signs, that something wasn't quite right. The Brown family, especially Megan's parents, had been growing increasingly uneasy about Adam's presence in their lives. They had hoped their daughter's relationship with Nicholas would shield her from the darker forces of her past. But Adam wasn't going to make it that easy. His obsession with Megan had deepened, and his unpredictable behavior was beginning to raise alarms. Neighbors reported seeing him lurking around the Brown home, sometimes standing in the yard, staring at the house as if waiting for something. The unsettling nature of his visits seemed to weigh heavily on those who noticed him, but for the most part, people dismissed it as an odd coincidence. After all, Adam had been a part of their lives at one point. But no one could have known the dark path he was about to walk down. The situation wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. And despite the growing unease, Megan continued to keep her distance from Adam. She had tried to move on, to escape his clutches, and she thought she had succeeded. Nicholas had brought her the happiness Adam could never give her. The couple was looking forward to their future together, a future that was being threatened by a man who had yet to let go of their past. It wasn't just about love anymore. For Adam, it had become about control, about his twisted need to possess Megan, to make her his and no one else's. The tension inside the Brown home grew by the day. Margaret and Greg Brown, protective of their daughter and her newfound relationship, had no choice but to watch as their worst fears began to unfold. Their daughter's safety had been jeopardized by a man who couldn't accept that the relationship was over. But the Browns weren't the only ones feeling the unease. Megan's friends and neighbors noticed it too. They would sometimes see Adam's car parked near the house or hear stories of him showing up unannounced, insisting on talking to Megan. Yet, he always found a way to slip through their defenses, his charm a mask that hid his true intentions. It was the type of behavior that might have seemed harmless to someone who didn't know the full story. But for Megan and those closest to her, it was a warning sign, a flashing red light in a sea of calm. Still, no one truly believed that Adam could take things to such an extreme. That is, until that fateful day when the horror would become all too real. On the morning of August 28th, the air in Hudson felt thick, like the calm before the storm. The Brown family had no way of knowing that their world was about to be shattered forever. Adam Matos had spent the days leading up to the murders preparing. The rage had been simmering within him for weeks, and now it was at a boiling point. He couldn't bear to see Megan with someone else, and he couldn't accept that he had been cast aside. His twisted mind made the decision for him. It was time to take everything back, to make sure that Megan and the others could never leave him again. He had a plan, and that plan involved blood. What followed was a nightmare no one could have ever prepared for. Adam's actions that day were swift, violent, and methodical. He entered the Brown home, where he had once been welcomed, and he turned it into a place of unspeakable horror. His victims, Megan, her parents Margaret and Greg, and Nicholas Leonard, had no chance. Adam's rage consumed him, and he didn't hesitate. The violence was brutal and merciless. There would be no second chances, no escape. For Megan and her family, it was the end of everything. The bodies of the victims were found just a mile away from the Brown home, discarded like trash in a remote wooded area. The discovery was shocking. The police, who had been called to perform a welfare check on the family, arrived to find the unimaginable. A scene of devastation, a family torn apart by the very person who had once been close to them. The crime scene was horrifying, but it would be the beginning of the search for answers. As investigators combed through the scene, trying to piece together what had happened, they quickly discovered that Adam Matos had vanished. His disappearance added an eerie layer to the case, leaving law enforcement with few leads and fewer answers. The entire town of Hudson was plunged into uncertainty. How could someone so close to the family commit such an act of terror? How had it all gone so wrong? The police launched an immediate search for Adam. The hunt for the man who had once been a part of the Brown family's life was now a race against time. Authorities scoured the area for any signs of Adam's whereabouts, but he had already slipped into the shadows. It became clear that the police weren't dealing with a simple crime. They were searching for a man who was capable of unspeakable violence. In the meantime, the town of Hudson was left in a state of shock. The killings didn't make sense. There were no answers, no clear motive. Adam Matos wasn't just an ex-boyfriend gone mad. He was a man who had calculated his actions with chilling precision. The community was grappling with the horror of the crime, and the media attention only amplified the sense of unease. For days, no one knew where Adam was. And with each passing hour, the fear in Hudson grew. It wasn't until a few days later that the police would finally catch a break. Adam Matos, hiding in a remote trailer in the Florida Panhandle, was taken into custody. His capture was swift, but it was far from the end of the story. The horror of his actions had only just begun to unfold, and the trial that followed would expose even more chilling details about the depths of his obsession. When Adam was arrested, he seemed cold, detached, almost as if the crime hadn't affected him at all. He wasn't frantic, he wasn't begging for mercy, he was numb. His arrest did little to quell the shock and outrage that had gripped the community. There was no apology, no remorse, just the grim reality that 4 innocent lives had been stolen by a man who couldn't let go of the past. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Adam's obsession with Megan was far more sinister than anyone had realized. He had been stalking her for weeks, showing up uninvited and making threats. His jealousy had consumed him to the point where he saw no other option but to take everything away. The brutality of the murders only confirmed the depth of his rage. Adam's actions left a scar on Hudson that would never heal. His betrayal of the family that had once trusted him was unforgivable, and the horror of what he had done was something the community would never forget. The people of Hudson would never be the same, and neither would the families of the victims, who would now have to live with the memory of their loved ones' untimely and brutal deaths. The search for answers had begun, but the pain would linger forever. In the days following the brutal murders, law enforcement worked tirelessly to track down Adam Matos, but his disappearance added an ominous layer to an already horrifying crime. The man who had once been part of the Brown family's life was now their nightmare. The community of Hudson was left in turmoil. How could someone so familiar, someone who had been trusted by the family, commit such an atrocity? It seemed incomprehensible. And the question that loomed over everyone's mind was, where was Adam Matos? The search was intense. The police scoured the area, speaking to neighbors, retracing his last known steps, and following every lead they could find. The fact that he had vanished without a trace only added to the mystery of the case. He knew the area well. He knew how to disappear. For several days, there was no word on his whereabouts. The authorities' frustration was mounting, and so was the fear in Hudson. Everyone knew that the killer was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be caught. The clock was ticking, and with each passing day, the chilling thought that Adam might never be found seemed to settle in. The media frenzy was reaching a fever pitch as well. News outlets from across the state descended on the town of Hudson, their cameras and microphones constantly on the lookout for any breakthrough in the case. The name Adam Matos was becoming synonymous with terror. The townspeople were in a state of constant fear, wondering if they too could be victims of this cold, calculating man. At the same time, the community couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. How could Adam, the man who had once been welcomed into their lives, turn into this monster? It was a question that didn't have an answer, at least not yet. Then, on September 1st, a break came. It was reported that Adam Matos had been captured. He was found hiding out in a small trailer in the Florida Panhandle, some 200 miles from Hudson. His arrest was almost anticlimactic, especially given the intensity of the search that had preceded it. The police didn't find him fighting, didn't find him desperate. He wasn't running from them. Instead, when they arrived at the trailer, Adam seemed almost indifferent. It was as though he had already given up, or maybe never even cared. His detachment was unsettling. There was no panic, no fear, just a cold acceptance of what he had done. He was arrested without incident and quickly transported back to Hudson. In the days following his capture, the full extent of Adam Matos's actions began to emerge. During his questioning, it became clear that he wasn't remorseful for what he had done. His lack of emotion was chilling. He didn't seem broken, he didn't seem scared. He was merely telling the police what they wanted to hear. But his words, his actions, and his demeanor all painted the same disturbing picture. Adam Matos was a man who had killed with no regard for human life, and he had done so because of his obsessive, twisted need to control Megan. He had made a choice that would leave 4 people dead and a community shattered. When the police began piecing together the details of the crime, the chilling reality of Adam's plan became clear. He had been stalking Megan for weeks, following her every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. His anger had been festering, and the jealousy he felt toward Nicholas Leonard had boiled over. Adam couldn't stand the thought of Megan being with someone else. In his mind, there was only one way to fix it: to take everything from her, to erase the people who stood between him and what he thought was rightfully his. The evidence at the scene of the crime confirmed just how brutal the murders had been. Megan and her family had been attacked in their own home, a place where they should have felt safe. Adam had shown no mercy. The violence was swift, deliberate, and horrifying. He had taken his rage out on them in a violent frenzy. There was no thought, no second chances. It was a calculated execution. He had even tried to hide his crimes, disposing of the bodies a mile away in a remote wooded area. He thought he could erase the horror, but he underestimated the reach of law enforcement. As the investigation progressed, Adam's actions and his twisted motives were made even clearer. It wasn't just the murders themselves, it was the years of obsession, the stalking, the manipulation, the control. His behavior had grown increasingly erratic as time passed. Adam Matos wasn't just an ex-boyfriend who couldn't let go. He was a man who had lost touch with reality. His entire world had become consumed with Megan, and when she moved on, he could not bear it. His need for control had led him down a path of destruction that had no return. When Adam was eventually charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, the media descended upon the case with an intensity rarely seen in small-town crimes. The Brown family's deaths were now national news. The story of Adam Matos, his obsession, his rage, his cold indifference, had captured the attention of millions. It was a case that seemed to haunt the airwaves, with each new detail sending ripples of shock through the public. His capture brought some sense of closure, but the damage had been done. The Browns were gone, their lives brutally snuffed out by a man who had once been trusted by them. As Adam stood in the courtroom during his trial, his cold demeanor didn't change. He offered no apologies. He didn't offer an explanation. His actions, his lack of remorse, and his indifference to the lives he had destroyed all painted a disturbing portrait of a man completely detached from reality. The prosecution laid out the case, presenting evidence of his stalking, his obsession, and the brutal nature of his crimes. But what made this case so haunting was the way Adam Matos refused to show any emotion. He didn't apologize for what he had done. Instead, he simply offered a statement that was as chilling as it was detached. "I'm sorry for what happened, but I can't explain why it happened." There was no remorse in those words, no explanation that made sense. Adam had done what he had done, and he didn't care about the lives he had shattered. He had destroyed a family, and in the process, he had destroyed himself. As the trial continued, it became clear that this was a case that would haunt the town of Hudson forever. The media frenzy surrounding Adam Matos had turned the small town into the epicenter of national attention. The horrors of the case, the brutality of the murders, and the chilling indifference of the killer made it impossible for anyone to look away. The story of Adam Matos wasn't just about a man who couldn't let go of a relationship. It was about the terrifying consequences of obsession, control, and violence. The trial would go on to reveal more of Adam's twisted psyche, more about his complete disregard for human life. But the one thing that was impossible to ignore was the damage he had done to the Brown family. 4 lives were taken in the blink of an eye, and no trial, no sentence could ever bring them back. The grief and pain that Adam Matos had caused would stay with the community forever. Hudson, a town once filled with peace and normalcy, would never be the same again. In the end, Adam Matos was convicted of all charges, and he was sentenced to death. But even as he was led away to prison, the horror of what had happened lingered in the air. The Brown family would never come back. Their names would be remembered not for the lives they led, but for the brutal end they met at the hands of someone they had once trusted. And the shadow of Adam Matos's actions would forever hang over Hudson, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in the most unlikely places. As the trial continued, the world watched, captivated by the details of the case. The courtroom was filled with an air of tension, a sense of anticipation that hung over every word spoken. Adam Matos, the man responsible for the brutal murders of Megan Brown, her parents Margaret and Greg, and her new boyfriend Nicholas Leonard, remained stoic as the proceedings unfolded. His behavior in the courtroom was eerily calm, almost detached. It was as if he had already accepted his fate. The prosecution presented their evidence, in an attempt to paint a clear picture of the horror he had unleashed. But Adam himself showed no emotion. He gave no apologies. He didn't offer any remorse. He didn't show any signs of regret for taking 4 innocent lives. The fact that Adam Matos was so emotionless, so cold in the face of his crimes, left many in the courtroom shaken. How could someone do something so horrifying and not feel any remorse? How could a person be capable of such brutal violence and not feel even a flicker of guilt? These were questions that no one could answer. And yet, despite his chilling indifference, Adam was about to face the consequences of his actions. When Adam's defense attorney spoke, the argument was clear. They wanted to portray him as someone who had been emotionally disturbed, someone who couldn't fully comprehend the weight of his actions. But even in the face of this defense, the jury knew what they had witnessed in that courtroom, the evidence of his cold-blooded murder spree. Adam Matos wasn't a man driven to violence by a moment of passion or an emotional outburst. His was a calculated act, one that had been driven by obsession, jealousy, and an insatiable need for control. The prosecution laid out the timeline of events, how Adam had stalked Megan, how he had shown up at her house, uninvited in the days leading up to the murders, how he had been lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting, convinced that he had a right to control her life. Adam's obsession with Megan had poisoned everything he touched, and in the end, it had led to the deaths of 4 innocent people. As the trial neared its conclusion, it became clear that Adam Matos's fate was sealed. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, their verdict was definitive: guilty on all counts. Adam was sentenced to death for the murders of Megan, Margaret, Greg, and Nicholas. His response to the verdict was chillingly muted. There was no outburst, no visible reaction. He simply stared ahead, as if the whole process had been a distant reality, something he had no connection to. But even though Adam had been convicted and sentenced, the questions remained. The questions that had plagued the minds of the people of Hudson and the millions of viewers who had followed this case from the beginning. Why did he do it? What drove him to such lengths? Was there ever a point where Adam could have been saved? Or was this violence always lurking inside him, waiting to emerge? Many people in the community struggled to reconcile the man they had once known with the cold-blooded killer he had become. How could someone who had once been a part of the family, a man who had shared meals with them, who had spent time in their home, turn so violently against them? It was a question that haunted the survivors, the friends, and the loved ones of the victims. It left a scar on the town of Hudson that would never fully heal. The fact that Adam had been able to blend into the community, to be trusted by the very people he later killed, made his actions all the more disturbing. How did they miss the signs? How could they not see the darkness that lay beneath the surface? And yet, the truth was undeniable. Adam Matos had chosen this path. He had made the decision to end 4 lives. He had taken that step, and nothing would ever bring those lives back. The community was left to pick up the pieces, but the damage had been done. The Browns would never be the same. Their friends and family would never fully recover. The grief that had been left in the wake of this tragedy was immeasurable. Now, years after the trial, the story of Adam Matos continues to reverberate. The case is still a topic of discussion, still a source of fascination for those who followed it from the beginning. But it also serves as a reminder of the darkness that can lie hidden in plain sight. Adam Matos's descent into madness, his obsession with Megan, and his brutal violence are a testament to the fact that some people are capable of unspeakable things, even when they seem just like anyone else. So, what do you think? Was Adam's behavior something that was always lurking beneath the surface, or do you believe something triggered this violence? Could anyone have stopped him? And what should the punishment be for someone who is so indifferent to the suffering they've caused? Is the death penalty truly justice, or does it just add to the cycle of violence? We want to hear your thoughts. Was this a case of a man driven by love gone wrong? Or is it simply a story of a mind unraveling? Do you think Adam Matos should have been given a chance for rehabilitation? Or is he beyond redemption? Leave your comments below and let's discuss this chilling case together. What do you think should happen next? What are your thoughts on the death penalty in cases like this? As we continue to remember the victims, let's not forget that the scars left behind by crimes like these are not just about the killer. They're about the families, the communities, and the people who are forever affected by what happened.